This is the third video in a series of 4 videos that give you a powerful advantage when debating no first use. You can greatly benefit from this third video even if you haven't watched the first and second videos. In this video, I explain how declaratory nuclear policy could affect U.S. relations with Russia and especially China in the long term. To be exact, I explore 4 momentous scenarios, everything from appeasement to versions of containment to rollback. For good measure, I place this debate about no first use in the dire context of the national debt.
I'm Dr. Joe Arminio, Senior Instructor here at Statesman Debate Institute. This video is part of an extensive classical topic analysis of no first use. This slide is entitled 4 Worldwide Impacts out to 2030. So I've given you 4 scenarios, and I'm measuring the impacts of these 4. And I'm going beyond the typical anecdotal measurements that you often find in conventional debate circles. The classically trained debater can go beyond the anecdotal, can quantify impacts. So the first scenario I'm entitling appeasement, and it assumes that no first use has been declared. This is not an uncommon impact that the affirmative will try to push forward, and it seems on the surface to be very appealing. The idea is this: America's on the brink of serious economic decline, yet we still have a position of strength. Let's broker that strength. Let's end up with not just strengthening the non-proliferation regime, but also reaching deep structural accommodation with the rising China. Now, one thing that happens, they overlook Russia, and that's a mistake. The affirmative does, and I'll explain the problem there. But the other thing is they don't realize what this appeasement would really entail. So let's take a closer look. So in the case of Russia, let's start with Russia. And this is a point I make in the second video and especially here in the 4th video. We don't realize Russia probably has a massive nationwide missile defense system. They're not going to be, it won't be easy to talk them out of that missile defense, to talk them into non-proliferation. It's their strong suit, their nuclear forces. So what would the compensation have to take? Well, it would probably involve giving them more ground in Ukraine, which will not make our European allies very happy, not at all. It also would probably involve serious monetary compensation, which would not make us very happy. If you look at the Russian GDP, you realize that in the 90s, we sent them into a deep depression. We intervened. It was called shock therapy. It didn't go very well. We tried to rush them into the capitalist order. In fact, we brought them into a period of chaos. It's only in the year 2000 that they began to resume their economic growth. They're going to want to be compensated. How much money might we be talking about? Well, I think if you run the numbers, you might say it might be as much as 1/2 of 1% of our gross domestic product every year. So not an inconsiderable amount of money. It could be as high as that. Now you may say, well, that's not very much money. Yes, but when you realize that we're heading into a rough economic period and we need to save money wherever we can, this is the last thing we can afford, is an expense of this order. But in the bigger scheme of things, the compensation or the concessions we'd have to grant to Russia, if we can convince the Russians to give up their missile defense system, is nothing compared to what we'd have to do vis-a-vis China. But first we have to mention something, which is we probably can talk them into strengthening non-proliferation. Now, up until now, that's not been easy because China's been weak. But now that it's becoming a global power, now they don't want to be afforded by proliferation any more than we do. If you look at where proliferation is most likely, so this is Persian Gulf and East Asia, these are precisely the areas that we can't afford to see proliferation take place, and nor can the Chinese, because the Chinese are trying to move into Africa and trying to move further out. And so for these reasons, that's the last thing they want to do. So I think they would embrace the strengthening of the non-proliferation regime. So far, so good. But if you want to make deep structural arrangements with the Communist Party, you're going to have to grant them concession, because the conventional forces is the Chinese strong suit. Conventional forces, the barrel of the gun, as Chairman Mao Zedong said, is how they maintain their position. They intimidate their Chinese populations and their near abroad and their neighbors through conventional power, especially. So you're asking them to give up that important asset. What are you going to have to give them in return? Well, if they can't intimidate Chinese populations by force through the barrel of the gun, then you have to give them ground. You have to take pressure off the democratic resistance movements among the Muslim populations in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and Taiwan. You have to let them rub out these resistance movements. So what you've ended up doing is strengthened the Communist Party. And yes, you've saved something, but I'm going to show you in a minute what have you ended up accomplishing. Well, you probably have rented a piece, and at the end of that 10-year period or so, you'll be paying, and then some, because the enemy will come back for his compensation with interest. And here's what I have in mind. What we've gained in the 10-year period, it could be as much as cutting defense in half. And you'll see how this is quantified in the fourth video in the series. Cut defense in half. And you think, oh my goodness, this is massive benefit. So that's quite good. Plus, the risk of war, nuclear and conventional, has been dramatically dropped, lessened. These are tremendous things, you would say. It's worth it. But here is the rub. First off, when you look at what cuts we have to make in our domestic programs, you realize that cutting defense by half, well, really pales in significance to the domestic cuts that we have to achieve. So what have you really gained? 10 years of leisure, you might say, but in return, you're going to pay for it and then some after 2030 or out in the more distant future. That's what I would expect. Now, the next scenario I call conventional containment. There's some hidden cost here that we need to pay attention to that often the affirmative will overlook. And I think if you'll listen, the negative can find some strong counters. As I say, there is a convergence of interest between China and the United States in the concept of non-proliferation. Not so much with the Russians, but more with the Chinese. Let's assume you can get that. Well, the problem is you're probably not going to want to offer the kind of deep political concessions that I mentioned you'd have to give if you appease them. You're going to have to contain China, which means your defense expenditures you're going to find are going to remain high. Defense expenditures are high. You're going to have to probably bring in your allies, which means multipolarity will increase. America's room for maneuver will be reduced. So when you're done, you have to weigh that with the fact that, yes, you have reduced the risk of nuclear war, but is it worth it? You've not reduced the risk of conventional war. In fact, you've increased that risk. Now we come to the third scenario I call rollback. And this is one that I don't see conventionally trained debaters making enough use of. Let's take a look at this. The idea here is we're continuing with the status quos, which we might call first use if necessary. That's our present declaratory nuclear policy. We're relying upon our conventional and nuclear deterrence, but we're also taking advantage of our splendid position in the Persian Gulf. As I mentioned at length in the second video in the series, and remind you of in the fourth video, China has this serious Achilles heel. They're desperate for the importing of oil. Often in debate, we'll hear about how North Korea is dependent upon oil. We're from China, but we don't realize how dependent China is upon Persian Gulf oil, and for that matter, oil coming elsewhere across the seas. So the idea here is that we squeeze China. We coerce them. We push them back. We tell them we have an advantage. Yes, we may be going into decline, but we still have this advantage. You need oil today. So what you're going to do is you're going to give ground to the resistance movement in Hong Kong. You're going to give ground. These are all legitimate demands. You're going to give ground to Taiwan, to Tibet, to the Muslim populations in the Northwest. It's the very opposite of the appeasement strategy. So what you're going to do is, while we still can do it, we're going to hasten the collapse of the Communist Party of China. Now, there is some risk here, and that's the problem. The trade-off is that you haven't moved away. Yes, on the non-proliferation front, you might be able to get them to agree to non-proliferation, but probably not now that you're rolling them back. You're going to increase the risk of war, both nuclear and conventional, but perhaps it can be managed. And in return, as America goes into a period of economic decline, you're probably going into a period now where you don't have a Communist Party of China to deal with. You've removed them. You're now probably more rapidly bringing on a more reasonable China, a more democratically based, more open China society. But there's the risk of war. The cost, the military cost, ironically, you might be able to reduce your conventional defense expenditures some. You might, which doesn't help you too much in terms of your economic issues. You've got deep domestic programs that need to be cut. But you are bringing on a world without the Communist Party of China. So a bit of upfront labor for long-term benefit. And then the fourth scenario, which is the most likely one the American elite will pursue, and that's one I'm calling conventional and nuclear containment of, well, China. So in this situation, we're going to continue to contain, I should also say, Russia and China. But here you may be surprised that even though you're not strengthening the non-proliferation regime, you're not necessarily weakening it either. Your nuclear deterrent especially is very helpful vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis North Korea. And you're going to find, though, interestingly enough, that you can actually afford some cuts in defense. And you're going to find you're not going to have to rely as much upon your allies, and so multipolarity will not be strengthened that much, at least out 10 years. So multipolarity, we'll say roughly what you have now. This has to be balanced against the fact that, yes, the risk of war, even nuclear war, remains significant, but can be managed perhaps. So here you have the four scenarios. I urge you to look at the fourth video in the series, see how we measure these impacts and how we, in some cases, even quantify these impacts. Here on the left side of this slide is an orthographic projection of the globe centered upon the United States. I offer you this visual emphasis upon the United States in order to draw your attention to what I'm calling the fifth impact of this no first use debate resolution. That is, that we must pay close attention to the details of the overriding economic peril right here at home. This November-December public forum debate underscores the limited merits of both no first use and first use if necessary. No matter whether the affirmative or the negative prevail, the peril of the national debt will essentially remain. In particular, it shows that coupling no first use and appeasement is not a panacea, even in the short term. Now, if you're in this no first use debate, and you're the negative, I can assure you, you're going to run into an opponent, an affirmative opponent, who is going to embrace no first use as a springboard to offering an appeasement to China. And he's going to tell you, America's on the brink of serious economic decline. Let's use our present strength for the better. Let's strike some kind of bargain and make things easier for ourselves as we go off quietly into the night. Don't believe any of this at all. And that's because you're not getting anything even out of it in the short term. And in the long term, as I mentioned in the previous discussion, the previous slide, you're probably going to end up with a Communist Party of China which is even stronger than you now have to deal with. Now, I go on to say that any savings, let's look at the next part of this statement, any savings in federal expenditures that might result from future declaratory nuclear policy would hardly do enough to reduce the quantitative side of the national debt peril. Now, what do I mean by all this? And let me still continue with this idea that that the negative is facing an opponent who's embracing no first use and appeasement. Well, the very best you can do, if you embrace no first use and appeasement, is to cut defense expenditures by about 1/2 per year. Now, where do I get that number from? Well, I suggest you take a look at the 4th video in this series that addresses no first use. Now, to cut defense expenditures by about 1/2, in effect, is to cut them by 1/2 of 1% of gross domestic product per year. And you may say, well, that seems very substantial. Yes, until you take a look at what we need to do to keep ourselves afloat financially. Let me take you down to the lower left-hand corner of the slide right now. Again, take a look at the 4th video, and there I explain that in order to remain financially sound, I mean just barely financially sound, I should say, we need to cut federal expenditures as a whole, not just defense, but federal government expenditures as a whole by 4.5% of gross domestic product per year. But truly, if we're going to maintain historically prudent levels, which gives us a very significant margin for error going forward, we're going to need to bring down expenditures by a lot more than even that, maybe something like 8% of gross domestic product a year. So now you realize what kind of an empty bargain the affirmative is making when they push for no first use and appeasement. They're saying they're going to find 1 and 1.5% of gross domestic product a year in savings, and yet you need to be saving something on the order of 8% of gross domestic product a year. That's why I say that this is a Faustian bargain that the affirmative may try to push on you that's not even valuable in the short term. I mean, out to the next 10 years. But there's more to it than that. So let me continue. And there I make the remark that these savings quantitatively would still leave untouched the far worse qualitative side of the national debt peril. And I am confident I could substantiate the deeper qualitative dimension if I took the time. So however bad it may be that we need to find 4%, 5, 6, really 8% of gross domestic product per year to cut from the federal budget, that's nothing compared to the much deeper structural qualitative changes to the debt that we need to be making. So what I'm suggesting to you is that hopefully this debate over no first use will wake us up to the darker domestic peril. Hopefully it will cause us to explore novel, far-reaching domestic solutions. Now, at this point, I have to admit, this is something of a digression from the no first use debate, but it's a worthwhile digression. Hear me out. We don't just engage in debate, do we, just for the fun of it, not just to win a debate competition or to become a national champion. We also engage in this to learn about world affairs, to prepare ourselves, you the debaters, prepare yourselves to become future leaders, responsible leaders. So go where the debate resolutions take you, and sometimes they take you somewhere that you can't use specifically in a debate round, but that you can make use of in the future. So I'm suggesting here that since we're now on to looking at the national debt, why not embrace the novel solution to healthcare that emerged out of the previous public forum Medicare for All debate? So why not, we're talking about a foreign policy debate resolution, no first use, build upon what we learned in the previous debate, which was a domestic policy resolution, when we looked at Medicare for All. And it so happens that emerging out of that domestic policy debate of September, October, was this novel so-called distributist healthcare solution. Now, where did this idea come from? Well, Statesman Debate Institute undertook a classical topic analysis of the previous Medicare for All debate, and in the process we uncovered distributism and this astonishingly promising solution to the healthcare crisis. It's so astonishing that in fact we might be able to massively cut federal government expenditures, like on the order that I've been talking about, really deep cuts, far better than what any possible or realistic defense budget cuts could give us. And not only that, we would be getting even better health care than we're presently getting. But most important of all, to entertain this distributive solution would shake things up, I think, to such an extent that the country might even entertain tackling the structural qualitative side of the debt peril. And if you want to see more about this distributive healthcare solution and what it could do in retiring the national debt on the quantitative side of things, take a look at Appendum 4 of the 4th video in this series of 4 videos. Now, where am I going with all this? What I'm suggesting to you is that it's one thing to talk about no first use and first use if necessary. But if we really truly want to improve our relations, if we really want to truly put the peace on a stronger foundation, then America needs to solve its debt problem both quantitatively and qualitatively. And if we will do that, we will transform our position, and indeed all mankind will thank us. Thus, this 3rd video in a series of 4 videos that address no first use. Each of these videos is certainly worth your time. Each offers powerful arguments probably not found elsewhere on the public forum debate circuit. They may well provide you with the element of surprise in competitions. They're certainly going to provide a more realistic view of world affairs. Why are these analyses so valuable? Because they're classically based. They're mostly original works. We draw heavily upon primary sources. These are not mere collations of anecdotal secondary sources. And when we use secondary sources, and we do, we go beyond the typical offerings of the think tanks. The think tanks have good things to say, but there's more out there than what they even point us toward. And you'd be surprised. And we make use, in particular, of some of the things that the think tanks don't serve up in this context of the no first use debate. The first video I call the prologue, and this introduces, among other things, the Roman concept of praetor maximus, which translated means dictator. This concept informs American practices on war, in fact, informs the maintenance of our nuclear deterrent. The second video measures U.S. conventional military deterrent, not just in the present, but out some distance, and that's crucial. That's crucial in this debate. Can conventional forces on their own keep the peace? That is, if not backstopped by our nuclear forces. It also references pertinent Cold War thinking, and it uncovers, of all things, what may well be Russia's massive missile defense system. The 4th video quantitatively measures this cluster of 4 impacts that were discussed in this 3rd video. In a sense, it gives you a forecast of what's coming around the world. It also says more about the 5th impact, namely novel fixes to our domestic problems, which may well redound to the maintenance of peace around the world. Get immediate access to videos 1, 2, and 4. Take a look at the description box at the bottom of this video. Click the relevant links. If you need help with this public forum debate resolution of no first use or anything of that kind coming up, look us up. We'd be glad to help. See you down the road. If you'd like to be trained in classical forensics and learn how to attain the mountaintop view that famous world leaders attained, the mountaintop view of public policy, government affairs, and history, then click the link in the description box of this video and it will take you to our catalog of academic year programs. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see a snapshot of that catalog. In this catalog, you will see a range of programs, including our nationwide online classically based debate league. There is nothing like it anywhere else in the country. We provide conventional debate training. We build upon that and provide classical debate training. You can see that we provide coaching in all manner of popular debate formats. We have our own version of government simulations, Model UN, Model Congress. We provide elite preparatory coaching for those going on to third-party Model UN conferences and Model Congress conferences. We offer AP history coaching, and last but not least, we provide BA, Master's, and PhD theses support.